Hello, gardeners, and welcome to Gabbing About Gardening. Today we have a very special guest. I love this lady. Every time I gab with her, I just learn so much. Connie Kuramoto. Connie is the owner, operator of Gardens on the Go, and this woman is always on the go. She is a horticulturist, an educator. She goes into schools. She offers courses on all aspects of gardening, and she's an environmentalist, educator, environmentalist, horticulturist, business gardens on the go. My goodness, Connie, thank you for taking the time to be with us today on Gabbing About Gardening.
Oh, you're welcome, Lou. I love to share what I know. And I am looking out on a plethora of weeds out there, but they can wait.
They're always there. It's like housework.
It's true. And it just means when I actually go to weed them, I have more organic matter if they're bigger.
Right on. You're talking my language, girlfriend. And today we are talking soil health. So let's start with the weeds because, you know, we just love to hate weeds, but they're actually a really important part of soil health, aren't they, Connie?
I don't know how I would ever make enough compost without weeds. I'd be driving all over the place to get stuff. I'd have to buy things to put in my compost, and that's just not my style. So my compost, the more weeds I have, the more compost I make, and the more compost I make, the better my garden is, weeds or no weeds. So yeah, I really appreciate weeds, and I have discovered that buttercups make the most deluxe rich compost I have ever used.
Okay, we got to hear your recipe for that, Connie, because buttercups really, you know?
I know, we all got them, right? And we all curse them, right?
Yeah.
I just pile them up in a corner. That's it. I just pile them up in a corner. When I first purchased this property, it was dead, burnt grass and weeds. And I started watering it, of course, and I started trying to grow things. And some of my earlier things were a disaster, including, unfortunately, some of the trees that I originally put in because it was sand, and no matter how much I watered, my water bills were outrageous. We're on community water here, and it just wasn't enough water. We also get a very strong wind here. And so things just dried out. It was a full-time job just keeping things watered. It was ridiculous. And I didn't dare show anyone my water bill because I felt like an ecological disaster using so much water. But over the years, as I've hauled more organic matter in, and it's gotten better, and I'm starting to get all these wonderful buttercups and other weeds growing like crazy, what has happened is I've made more and more compost and been able to put it back into my soil. And so right now I look at weeds as gifts. Unless, of course, they start strangling my plants like bindweed.
and then they're gone. They're out of there.
Well, they're out of there anyway. What I do with bindweed is I let it dry. So I throw it on a tarp or a handy gravel driveway or sidewalk or something, or in a hot metal wheelbarrow, and just let it dry there. And then I put it in my compost. It does not resprout once it's crunchy.
Well, I know some people would argue that point with you. I'm not one of them. I've never had a problem with bindweed. Knock on my wooden table right here.
Oh, you want something to experiment with?
No, thank you. I'm going to take your word for it. You're the expert. So, hey, Connie, let's get back to buttercups. I was reading some of your posts on your fabulous Facebook page and also on the Gabbing About Gardening Facebook page, and you have a certain method, and then you grow stuff on top of the pile. Can you tell us about that?
Oh yeah, that's something I just started this year, because before At first, I was just piling them up, the buttercups up by my front fence. I've got, you might even hear in the background, I've got a 6-lot subdivision going in across the street from me. So I'm just planting. I just really needed to plant up the front of my yard to buffer myself. And so what I started doing right when the property went for sales, I started just piling the buttercups up there. And that's when I discovered that, sure, there was a coating of buttercups on top of this berm, but underneath the soil was just so full of worms and so juicy and gorgeous. And I never like layered brown and green, or I never did anything like that. I just piled the buttercups up. I figured some organic matter is better than no organic matter. And when I saw what rich compost it made, I went, I know of a few squash plants that might really like this. And so what I started to do, and so far it's been really quite successful, is I've been piling the buttercups up. I've got a squash patch that I rotate every year. But this year's squash patch was last year's winter garden patch. So there's the odd kale plant still in it, and there's a broccoli going to seed. But around that, what I've been doing is I've been piling the buttercups up. And then after I get a nice mound of buttercups, which is really easy to do in my yard, it happens really quickly. Then what I do is I take like lots of newspaper. Like I save all my newspaper. I go to the community mailbox, and if people haven't collected their newspapers, I collect their newspapers. And cardboard, I'm always asking for cardboard and paper bags and everything like that I can get my hands on. And so I'll cover the buttercups with the bags and the cardboard and the feed sacks and everything paper that I can get my hands on. And then I'll make a well in it. So I'll kind of make a little well that's, maybe the size of a 8-inch pot kind of thing, as deep and as wide as about an 8-inch pot. And then I'll line that with some newspaper too. And then I'll fill that with some finished compost. So, I do have some compost here, and I also get a load of compost from Pyramid Stables every year. And so I'll fill that with compost, and then I'll plant my squash plant. And what I found is the ones that I did like that have thrived way better than the ones that I didn't do like that.
Now, are you using seeds or seedlings, Connie?
Seedlings.
Okay.
Seedlings, yeah.
So let me just get this straight. You're basically building a kind of volcano, a small volcano, or a mound of buttercup. You're creating a recession on the top. You're layering it all with newspaper and cardboard to keep it smothered. And then in the recession, you're adding compost, I imagine several inches, and then you plant your squash seedling in there. And the buttercups don't come through. Do you use plastic as well?
I don't use any plastic. And yes, every once in a while, a buttercup will rear its ugly head, and I'll pull it out and I'll put it in the new mound that's next door. And
you're building your own 6-unit suburbia there out of your buttercups. I love it. I can just visualize it.
Yeah, and so there's all these mounds, and then at the bottom, around the bottom of the mounds, I'm also planting things because, of course, there's going to be some nutrient runoff from that as well. So I'm really pleased with the results so far. And we had that hot weather, but then we had that skanky cold weather, the January thing. And the plants that were sitting in there didn't miss a beat. And I thought, why is that? And then I realized when I stuck my hand in there that the buttercups were decomposing, and they weren't producing a tremendous amount of heat, but they were producing just enough heat to kind of keep things a little bit warmer.
Nice. I'm doing that. I'm doing that. What I do right now with my buttercups to build soil health, because that is the topic today, is not necessarily buttercups and weeds, folks. We really are talking about soil health and using weeds to build soil health, which I really love this direction we're going, Connie, because people want healthier soil. They hate weeds, especially buttercup. So I've not done your method as such yet. I am going to try it out. I've been doing what I call the black bag method, where I put everything in a black plastic garbage bag, but you're an avowed environmentalist, so I imagine you don't use that method. But what I do is, after a year sitting on the ground in another place in my garden where I want to be able to plant, so I'm smothering the buttercup underneath of the bag full of buttercups.
Yeah.
That bag full of buttercup. Oh, and I put a few holes in there so the worms can crawl in, just, with a fork or a skewer stick or something, for air as well. And in a year, I just have this beautiful crumb. So I can totally believe you when you say that it's building. So a lot of weeds have exudates and fiber and really add to the humus of our soil when we compost them, don't they?
Well, actually, weeds actually even really add to the soil when they're in our garden. They're feeding microbes. So we might not like them, but that's why they're there, is that weeds are replenishing the soil. They're feeding the microbes that are in the soil. And so, I think that's why there's so many worms. When you pull up a buttercup, well, when I pull up a buttercup anyway, that's where the worms are living, is underneath there, because they're eating the microbes that are dead or alive. They're eating the microbes that are feeding off the exudates of your weeds. So you're actually better off to have weeds in your soil than to have barren soil. So, I mean, yes, they can crowd out some of your other stuff, which is, of course, their disadvantage, but weeds are building soil. And any old-time gardener will tell you that the population of weeds in some cases sort of changes over time. And there's a reason for that as well, is that weeds are actually key to repair soil deficiencies. So say you are planting something in a certain place, and of course it's removing a certain amount of nutrients from your soil, and the weeds that will grow there afterwards are ones that Mother Nature is choosing to replenish those nutrients that were lost. So that's also why that chop and drop method works really well, because say bracken fern is full of potassium. So if you have bracken fern coming up, that's replacing the potassium in your soil.
Let's just back up a wee little bit, because I don't want to assume that everybody knows what we're talking about when you use the term chop and drop. Can you just teach us a little about that, please, Connie?
Sure. So chop and drop is just a method, and you can't use it with all weeds. It's hard to use with all weeds and still sort of keep them from overgrowing your plants, but it works really good with young weeds. It works really good with annual weeds, where what you do is you just basically chop their heads off and leave them there. So really that's what a hoe does, is it just chops off the weeds, chops their heads off. Many annual weeds, that'll be the end of them. They'll just die after that. The perennial weeds is where it becomes more difficult, but still, if you chop their heads off enough times and they can't kind of replenish their root quickly enough, then they also will end up exhausting their big perennial root. So, and meanwhile, if you chop them and leave them right where they are, the chop and drop, then what happens is those weeds will repair the nutritional deficiencies in your soil, and they turn
So
into mulch.
yeah, I was just going to ask you, they must have a dual purpose with the mulch as well. Now, are there actually soil building plants that you recommend we plant? We've talked a lot about, not being afraid of weeds, embracing the weeds for the benefits that they do bring to our soil and how to use them to build healthy soil. What are some of the plants that you grow specifically, not just to fix nitrogen, but to use for chop and drop, for instance?
Well, I don't recommend it for everyone unless you're very careful, but I do have a lot of comfrey here. And it was here when I got here. It was one of the few things that were living, which is one of the testaments of its tenaciousness. But I have the kind that spreads. You can get a kind of comfrey that doesn't spread. It's called Bocking 14, and you can get it from Richter's Herbs. And so I really recommend comfrey. I mean, I was out there last night and I was cutting comfrey that's a couple feet tall and chopping it and just dropping it. I cut all the flowers off. Like, I leave it until the flowers are just starting to die. And sometimes there's still a few flowers on it because, of course, the flowers sort of, the first flowers are done and the last flowers are still flowering. So I do rob the bees a little bit. I figure they have enough raspberry blossoms now that they can finish on those. And so I chop it, and I do chop the tops off that have anything that might have seeds in it, so I don't spread it anymore because I have more than enough. But and I use comfrey to make fertilizers. I use comfrey in my compost. I use comfrey for mulches. And so if you can, put a stand of that Bocking 14. I can't recommend the other stuff that spreads because I don't really know how invasive it was and how it would affect our ecosystem if it ran loose. I have a feeling it would be kind of negatively. So, I mean, I'm always mixed about the invasive plant thing anyway, but comfrey can be a bit of a thug.
It's very successful, as
very successful. The first time,
and opportunistic.
It is. The first time I got comfrey, I got it from a woman on the West Coast. Her name was Norma Bailey, and she was the most amazing woman, pioneer woman. I haven't heard her whereabouts lately, or don't know if she's even on this planet anymore, because she was much older than me, and a bit of a mentor. And she gave me my first comfrey plants. I brought these comfrey plants home in a cardboard box. I dropped it on my gravel driveway. I went commercial fishing for 3 months. And when I got back, I had a 4x8 patch of comfrey.
Oh, I love it. That's amazing.
Right?
So, yeah. So I love the flowers. The bees love the flowers. Tell us how you make your comfrey tea and your fertilizer with comfrey, which is for feeding the microorganisms in the soil, right?
Really helpful to feed the microbes in the soil. And that's also why comfrey leaves are so good in your compost, because they're just full of those micronutrients that microbes just thrive on. So what I do is I just basically throw it in a bucket and add water until it stinks. I let it sit until it stinks. So, a few days, or sometimes I don't get to it for a week, then it really stinks. But, when the water starts to discolor and stuff, it's obviously getting some of the nutrients out of it. And then I strain it out and pour it on whatever needs it.
Now, are you concerned about the whole aerobic anaerobic issue? Because I tended to take my concentrate that you just described making, the really stinky stuff, putting it in a bigger bucket, like a 5-gallon bucket. So I'll take maybe just one of those small yogurt buckets, put that tea in the 5-gallon bucket. And then I take my hose and use a lot of water pressure, and it foams up and it doesn't smell so bad. And then I use that as a concentrate.
It is always better to aerate it if you can in some way, because you are breeding the wrong kind of organisms when you do that. But anaerobic organisms, if you are pouring it, say, I use a lot of it on, say, my fruit trees, my berry bushes, and that sort of thing. I don't so much use it on my lettuce plants. I think I would be way more careful to aerate it if I used it on my lettuce plants.
Okay,
Things
so
like
you're
that.
really focused on the root structure of perennials rather than your edible annuals. That makes sense. Okay, so come for your compost pile, for a fertilizer tea, for chop and drop. What about some nitrogen fixing plants that you have found useful in building your soil, Connie?
I love clover. I just love clover. And yeah, some of the clovers get into my garden beds, and yeah, I weed them out, but advantage to clover, I find, is the wild rabbits that are around here. They really prefer my clover to eating my lettuce plants.
Wow,
So
that's a huge advantage.
that's a huge advantage. And
Yeah.
places that I've seeded clover heavily, it does compete, not fully successfully, but partially successfully with the buttercups.
Yep. I
So
have
that's
found that too. Are you
another
using the
advantage.
Dutch white clover mainly?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah, good.
another one I use that I love is the crimson clover.
Mm.
Crimson
And
clover.
that's not the tall red clover
It
stuff.
is. It's the tall one with the really different looking red
Right.
blossom.
And
It's
those red
not the purple clover.
The red blossoms are used as a blood cleanser for tea. They are used in the Hoxsey Clinic for cancer.
I didn't know that those were the
Blood
ones that
cleansing.
use the crimson clover.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Oh,
red clover.
lovely.
Yeah. Okay, well, tell
And
us how you use it.
well, I've got this subdivision going in across the street from me, and the water line is on my side of the road. And so when they were digging up, they just totally destroyed. I had the beginning of kind of it is the boulevard, so it isn't mine, and I had the beginnings of kind of a wild flower garden out there, and they totally destroyed it, and dug it up and put gravel on it, and just totally made a mess of it. And so the first thing I did is I went out there and I threw some crimson clover out, some seed out, and forgot about it actually. And I couldn't believe it. I probably did it last year sometime. And this spring, all of a sudden, there's this beautiful patch of crimson clover growing in the gravel. It's amazing stuff. It grows where I can't imagine anything else growing in.
It really lifts your heart, doesn't it? I mean,
Oh,
not
and
just
to
because
see
of
the
flowers.
flowers.
Yeah, and just to know that you can broadcast these seeds and have life come out of all of this destruction. Hey, Connie, can we move into another realm of questioning? Thank you so much for that. We've got comfrey, we have white clover, we have crimson clover. I'm sure there's lots more, and we'll talk more about that when we gab again. But what is your philosophy and approach to the question of no dig versus rototilling versus a little digging? What have you morphed into in your many years as a gardener? It's a really
Well, I used to run a rototilling business.
wow. Okay.
I used to have a Troy 8 horsepower rototiller.
Wow.
And so that's where I started. I had heavy clay soil on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and that's where I started. Then I morphed into double digging, and found that with double digging and mulching, that I didn't have to rototill. So I started to go away from that. And then I learned about sheet mulching and lasagna bed growing. And that can be pretty successful. I mean, you never lose by adding organic matter on top of your soil. You never lose. But I did find that sometimes the soil underneath is just too compacted and I am too impatient. If I had more time, I am sure that just layering organic matter on the surface of my soil would improve my soil immensely. But what I've taken to now in starting new areas and kind of, even areas that I've gardened before, but maybe have become overtaken with weeds. What I do now is I do still start out with layering organic matter, because my soil is funny. It's sand, but it still compacts. It's more like silt, really, but it's the oddest soil. I've never seen anything like it, and yet it turns to powder when it's dry. And I found this useful in a few different situations, is start out by layering with organic matter. That always works. But then if you want to plant in it sooner, if you can get some sort of fork into it and just kind of loosen it up to get air into the soil. And then also what happens with that method is that some of the organic matter that you pile on top and some of the compost that you pile on top will kind of filter down into those holes and cracks and crevices, and it really speeds up the process. So I do sort of find that now, and I, like you, sometimes use the method. I don't use plastic bags, but what I do is if I want to extend the garden out on top of what's, say now, grass, is I'll lay cardboard down and then I'll stick pots on top of it to hold the cardboard down. And then, so instead of the plastic bags, but what happens, I find, is that some of the nutrients are bound to run out of the soil that's in the pots. And then once I move the pots over and lift up the cardboard, the soil has no weeds. It tends to look really lovely and rich, and it just seems to work really well. And then I just move the pots and the cardboard over a little further and eliminate even more lawn.
Yeah, it's a fabulous process. Thank you so much for describing it, Connie. We're coming up to the end of our time together, and I want to just give I know, right? That's why I said we have to gab again really soon. I just love gabbing with you. And, layering organic matter, that's a core message. I love the loosening with the fork. I'm using a lot more of that. As you know, I'm a pretty strong advocate of a no-dig gardening style.
Yeah.
And I've learned, so much from you today in this gab. What would you like to say as your parting words of advice to us when it comes to building soil health in our gardens? What is a gem you can leave us with?
Well,
today?
I've taught a lot of classes, and I've with students sometimes for 12 weeks, in a row, and not so much anymore, but I have been, and at the end they always laugh and they go, all you could have told us is add organic matter.
I love it.
And,
Speaking
you
of,
know, quite frankly, that's the one thing everybody can do, and you can't go wrong with it. And there are some people that say, oh, you can add too much organic matter. Well, I have not seen that or heard of it very often yet.
I'm with you. I'm with you. And just to
So,
clarify what organic matter is, we're talking leaves, cut grass, weeds, wood chips, manure, compost, straw,
lawn
cardboard, newspapers,
clippings. Yeah, all the above. Manure,
all of the above, green
all
and
of the
brown and
above.
black and yellow and gray.
And quite frankly, I bury fish in my garden too. I bury fish, you know, we get fish here, and because my husband's a fisherman, and I clean the tuna and I dig a big hole and I bury it around my fruit
There you
trees.
go. There you go. And those
So,
microorganisms love you. Hey, before we go, Connie, tell us about the courses that you have available, how people can take advantage of that, how they can follow you on your Facebook page. People are going to want to check you out, girl.
all right. Well, I run a business called Gardens on the Go, and I don't always keep that Facebook page up because I just post so much on my regular Facebook page. So you can either follow me, you know, Connie Kuramoto, or Gardens on the Go. There's another resource, and I post semi-frequently, called the Aerosmith Organic Gardening Group on Facebook. And that was started by myself, Dirk Becker, who you might have heard of, and Nicole Shaw, and Susan Vigneault, who is also an amazing gardener. And so it's a really good resource for people. So I often post on there and answer questions. I'm also teaching a series of classes through the Doig House, which is an Earthship project just up the road from me. And they'll be on Eventbrite. And so if you log into Eventbrite and look for classes on gardening in this area, some of them have been virtual. We're sort of hoping to get more into hands-on. But I think this virtual format is great because it reaches so many people. So it has the potential to just reach so many people. And it's also a really good, it's got a really good carbon footprint because nobody has to drive anywhere.
It's
So
turned out to be a real blessing in a lot of ways.
Amazing.
So that's Connie Kirimoto. That's Kuramoto. People can find you through the internet and find out more about your courses. Thank you so much for this, Connie.
Thank you.
A wealth of information. We'll gab soon. Now let's get outside and get dirty, Connie.
Yeah, you bet. I got a class this afternoon.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you. We'll talk again soon.
Talk again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye, Connie. You've been listening to Gabbing About Gardening. We've been talking with Gardens on the Go teacher, community teacher, horticulturist, educator, environmentalist, Connie Kuramoto, and her tips on soil health. Thank you for being with us. We'll talk to you, gab with you next time. Bye-bye now.
Bye, Lou.
Bye, Connie. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.